We're going to keep going forward in chapter 15. In this section, we're going to be talking about bivariate statistics. The chapter as a whole is sort of a broad overview of a lot of different topics in statistics. So there's some nice flow from one section to the next, but especially toward the end here, we kind of jump around to a few different ideas. So this isn't super connected to what we just did in the last section with normal distribution, but is kind of another area of statistics that we want to put some focus on. So bivariate statistics, prefix bi meaning two, variate meaning variables. So we're talking about statistical settings where there are two variables, and we're trying to see if there's a relationship between those two variables. So bivariate statistics are used to analyze the relationship between two sets of data. For example, let's think about the relationship between math and critical reading scores on the SAT. So we have a table here with each column is a student, that's their math score and their critical reading score for 8 or 9 different students. So the first thing we need to make sure we're comfortable with is drawing a scatter plot. This is the simplest way to observe a relationship between two variables, is to plot the two variables on the same axes. I'm assuming that you've done scatter plots in the past, so I don't want to over-explain here, but just to make sure we remember the most important basic ideas, we want to label our horizontal and vertical axes. We want to give them a scale that is consistent. They don't necessarily have to have the same scale as each other, but we do want the scale to be consistent all the way through the scale, and it doesn't have to start at 0. That's also fine if it doesn't start at 0. Okay, but what is important is that you make sure you label each axis, the horizontal and vertical. So typically, I would just say the top row, let's call that the x or independent variable. In this particular example, they're interchangeable. Math and reading, one doesn't depend on the other. They could go either way, but we'll call the horizontal axis math and the vertical axis critical reading. It is important that you label your axes, and it's also good to label your whole plot. So maybe call it SAT math versus critical reading, something like that. So important things to make sure you have: label your axes, give a good, consistent, clear scale on both axes, and then remember the idea of the scatter plot is to treat each pair of scores as a single point on the plot. So this is one student here who got a 530 in both. So we'll plot him at 530 on the horizontal axis and 530 on the vertical axis, right? And we want to give each student a point on the plot. So this next student had a 551 in math and a 529 in reading. So we'll come to 551 in math, go up to 529 in reading. So roughly right there is that second student. Okay, and we want to keep going through all of these points here. So 1%, 521 in math, 512 in reading, 521, 512. And each point, or each column, is a student, and each student's going to get a point. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and plot the rest of the points. Okay, so now we have all of the points plotted, and this is our completed scatter plot. All right, there it is. Again, I'm hoping that that is a review, that you've learned how to draw scatter plots in the past, so I don't want to belabor that. But again, important things to make sure you notice: consistent scale on each axis. They don't have to have the same scale, but you do need to label both axes, and make sure you have a good title for your graph as well is a good idea. And make sure there's a point for each student in this case, or each subject, or each pair of variables here. And there's scatter plots. The one thing I did want to show is how we can do this in Excel as well. But we'll go ahead and do that in the next video.